The Green Lantern mythos is a mythos that DC has sadly never taken full advantage of in live action, but now with the introduction of James Gunn's new DCU, we finally may have an opportunity to fully explore the Green Lantern mythos and how cool it is for DC as a whole. And the Green Lantern mythos seems to be a priority over at DC Studios because in the first chapter we're getting Lantern Season 1. However, the direction that they're taking with this series is a little bit concerning for a lot of Green Lantern fans, including myself. And that's obviously because of the fact that we're starting off with a veteran Hal Jordan who is already 60 years old, and if the actor's age is indicative of the character's age in this universe, which is the case for David Cornswood's Superman, that means that Hal Jordan at this point in his career would have already gone through all of the major Lantern events without us seeing it. Or worse, he hasn't, and he's going to be replaced and killed off in Lantern Season 1, which would mean that we essentially had no good Hal Jordan in this universe, which is a nightmare scenario for the Green Lantern mythos because of how important Hal Jordan is to it. There literally isn't any main Green Lantern event story that you can tell properly without Hal Jordan at the epicenter. Blackest Night, Hal Jordan's at the epicenter. Sinestro Core War, Hal Jordan's at the epicenter. So you quite literally need to have Hal Jordan around for these projects to be as good as they are in the source material. And simply putting John Stewart in Hal Jordan's place, in my opinion, is a bad move. But let's not jump the gun, ladies and gentlemen, because even though what we know so far about Lantern's Hal Jordan isn't that good, there's still a way that the DCU can salvage it, and in this video I'm going to explain the ideal Green Lantern saga for the DCU. But very quickly before we start the video, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share if you do in fact enjoy the content. Now that we finished the hoopla, the very first project that is going to start off this saga is obviously Lantern Season 1. And so far, based off of what we know, it's going to be a veteran Hal Jordan and a rookie John Stewart basically uncovering this deep dark mystery that ties into the overarching story of the DCU. Now obviously this show has already been shot, it's already been cooked, and there's nothing that can really change about it at this point. So because of that, I'm not really going to get into what I think should happen, but rather what we know is confirmed for the show so far. Starting with the characters that are set to appear, we obviously know we're getting our main two Green Lanterns in Hal Jordan and John Stewart, but we're also getting Guy Gardner Green Lantern. And that in itself is pretty cool because we already have 3 out of the 4 corpsmen. Let's just pray that Hal Jordan can live to actually see them team up. Now the next characters that I name are going to be a little bit tricky because I have my own fan speculation of who these characters actually are, and I don't think that these names that they're given are their actual names. I think that these are just code names to keep the audience from knowing what's going to happen in the show. And as I read the descriptions of these characters, you'll start to see what I mean. And there's also some teasers from the cast members themselves that kind of support what I'm saying. So first things first, we have Portia Jagannathan cast as Zoe, and obviously there is no character in the Green Lantern mythos named Zoe, so who could she really be playing? Well, if we read the description that they give us for her character, it says Jagannathan will play Zoe, who is effortlessly confident and poised in any setting, even those where she stands out. She's every bit as composed and cunning of the influential men around her, and Zoe is rumored to be a love interest for John Stewart. Now initially, what stood out to me the most in this description is the fact that she's every bit as composed and cunning of the influential men around her. Now obviously this is a show with Green Lanterns, but if she's just this average town woman, what men around her are going to be so influential that she needs to then modify her persona to become every bit as cunning and composed as them? The next thing that I found important is that she's effortlessly confident and poised in any setting, even those where she stands out. Now again, if she's just this average town woman, I don't see why she would even stand out in the first place. But to me, ladies and gentlemen, the clincher for this theory is that it then says that she's rumored to be a love interest for John Stewart. And with all of that being said, this points me into the direction of none other than Kot Matui, who in the comics was very pivotal in training John Stewart when he was a rookie and is also a love interest for him early in his career. And we've actually seen this dynamic adapted in the DCAU with Justice League. On top of that, the more I look at Portia Jagannathan, the more I can't help but notice that she does kind of resemble Kot Matui. So that's who I honestly think she's playing, but again, this is just speculation, so take it with a grain of salt. Next up, we have Ulrich Thompson playing Sinestro, who I'm assuming is going to be the main antagonist of this series, but I could be wrong. He could just be one of the antagonists. But nonetheless, his description basically confirms that he's a rogue Green Lantern that is obsessed with his former mentee, Hal Jordan. Next up, we have another really interesting one, and this is Garrett Dillahunt, who is cast as William Macon. Now this one is interesting because his description is described as a modern cowboy who is a self-righteous and conspiracy-minded man who masks his ruthless ambition behind a charming and calculated facade. Now again, William Macon isn't a character who exists within the Green Lantern mythos. However, there is a William Hand, and funnily enough, Garrett Dillahunt has actually teased that he could in fact be playing Black Hand. But before I showcase that tease, I want to get into one more casting that completely solidifies it for me, and that casting is is none other than Paul Ben Victor, who is playing a character named Anton. Now again, obviously Anton is not a character that exists within the Green Lantern mythos, but when we look at the description of the character, it says, Anton, an extraterrestrial devoted to exposing the truth and exacting vengeance against those who wronged his people. Consumed by a deep and unrelenting hatred for the law, he is determined to deliver justice on his own terms. I can't help but think that sounds exactly like Atrocitus. And Anton is just the code name that they're using to keep this a secret, because that description is literally bar for bar Atrocitus. And I genuinely don't think that they would create an entirely new character to do the exact same thing that Atrocitus does. Like, it just wouldn't make any sense. But back to Garrett Dillahunt potentially playing Black Hand, a fan who has a similar theory to me where these names that these characters are being given are just code names, posted a picture of not only Ulrich Thompson, who is confirmed to be playing Sinestro, but also of Garrett Dillahunt and Paul Ben Victor, and for them he put a picture of Black Hand and Atrocitus, and Garrett Dillahunt actually reshared this post with the thinking emoji. And on top of all this, Garrett Dillahunt actually posted a video of him getting tested for a costume. And if he's just playing a modern cowboy, what does he need a tight fitting costume for? And again, those are his words. He said that this costume is going to fit tight like a glove. So with that being said, in the event that these theories are actually true, we could potentially be getting not only Sinestro, but also Black Hand and Atrocitus in Lanterns, along with Guy Gardner, Kot Matui, John Stewart, and Hal Jordan. And this doesn't even include characters who we actually don't know are going to appear in the show. That being said, we still pretty much know nothing about the show outside of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, so I'm not going to speculate that much, but all I will say is that I do hope that if Hal Jordan does die, that it could set the stage for him to potentially come back as younger, and I'll explain in this video how they can do that. And that brings me to the second project in this saga, which would be Lantern Season 2. Now at this point, after the events of Lantern Season 1, I'm assuming that John Stewart would have become the main Lantern of the DC Universe as it stands right now, and he would actually just be working with the Justice League. Another thing that's important to note that I actually forgot to mention in the Lantern segment of this video is that Tom King also actually teased Parallax Hal Jordan for Lanterns, which in my opinion, again in conjunction with everything the writers have said about the show and it being about replacement, simply confirms that Hal Jordan is probably cooked at the end of Season 1. But like I said, it can all be better because now we enter Kyle Rayner. And that's who I would want Lantern Season 2 to personally follow. And for this, they could basically loosely adapt Green Lantern 1990 when Kyle Rayner actually took over the reins in the comics. However, we obviously don't know if they're going to do Parallax Hal Jordan bar for bar like how it's done in the comics, with Mongol destroying Coast City, and then Hal wreaking havoc on the rest of the Green Lantern Corps, which is how Kyle Rayner traditionally became Green Lantern in the comics. That being said, I still don't see them doing Parallax Hal Jordan and then not having Kyle Rayner eventually come into the fold in some way, shape, or form, so I still think that they should do that. And then while Kyle Rayner is the main Lantern that we follow during Lanterns, I think that we should also follow Hal Jordan as the Spectre. So while John Stewart is on Earth predominantly with the Justice League and helping out the other heroes and doing those types of Green Lantern things, Kyle Rayner can be the main Lantern doing the cosmic Green Lantern things, and then we can focus on Hal Jordan and kind of get a backdoor into his life while he is the Spirit of Vengeance, the Spectre. And this would honestly be a great way to continue to flesh out DCU Hal Jordan's lore and mythos, because of the fact that we're seeing him at such a late point in his career already, and the universe literally just started. So seeing him reflect as the Spectre on his life and how he got to that point would really be cool in my opinion. And the events of Lantern Season 2 could directly tie into the first live action movie in the Green Lantern mythos since 2011, and that is going to be Green Lantern Rebirth, the movie. And as you guys can tell, this movie is going to loosely adapt Green Lantern Rebirth by Jeff Johns, which is in my opinion one of the best Green Lantern stories ever written. Now obviously in this comic we get a lot of retcons to Hal Jordan's lore and mythos because of the fact that in the 90s when he initially became Parallax, Hal Jordan was drawn visibly older in that series, and that was just because they wanted him to be older at the time. However, Green Lantern Rebirth retconned that to making it so that Parallax was actually the reason why Hal aged so rapidly, and it was because Parallax's fear was stressing Hal Jordan so much that he literally got grays and got wrinkly skin, like any person would when they're experiencing extreme fear or stress, just obviously at a much faster rate. And this all came to a head when Mongol obviously destroyed Coast City with Cyborg Superman. Now, being that we don't actually know if the destruction of Coast City is something that's going to happen in the DCU, and I honestly wouldn't bet money on it, I don't think that that element obviously should stay the same, but I do think that they could pull from the element of him being de-aged. And there's two ways that they could do this in the DCU. The first way they'd be able to do it is if Kyle Chandler's age actually isn't indicative of how old Hal Jordan is in Lanterns. Kyle Chandler is 59 in real life, but this doesn't have to mean that Hal Jordan is also 59 in Lanterns continuity. The only reason this seems likely is because of the fact that the DCU so far has been casting the actor relative to the age that they want the character to actually be. However, there are some cases where the actor is a little bit older than the age that they're actually playing, and an example of that would be Millie Alcock as Supergirl, who is currently, I believe, 25 or 26, and is playing a 21-year-old Supergirl in Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow. So hypothetically, if Hal Jordan is actually 40 in terms of DCU continuity, they could just explain his aging as a byproduct of Parallax's possession of him. And when Spectre gives him the opportunity to reclaim his body with Parallax no longer infecting him, he can revert back to his normal youth. The second way they could do it is that Hal Jordan could actually be 59 years old, but then when he dies and comes back as the Spectre, during that time he could obviously redeem himself, and then the Spectre could grant him a second chance at life and also restore him back to his prime. Now personally, I like the first option a lot more than the second option because of the fact that it's a little bit more comic accurate and it actually makes a little bit more sense than him just like simply returning back to his youth, especially considering that then all the other characters around him like Carol Ferris would also just be in their 40s and they wouldn't actually be older while he's now back to being young. And then by the time something like this happens, there's a bunch of actors that you could easily slide into the Hal Jordan role. You would just have to find an actor that kind of resembles Kyle Chandler, which in my opinion, I don't think is that hard to do. And honestly, I don't even think it would be that important because it wouldn't be the first time that we saw a recast in this genre. And we could easily point to examples like Edward Norton getting replaced by Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk, and then also a similar situation with Rhodey in the MCU. And James Gunn has already said that he's fine with replacing actors if they can no longer play a role, especially if that character is needed for the story. But long story short, like I said, I would want this movie to be an adaptation of Green Lantern Rebirth, and I would also want Sinestro to be one of the antagonists, with Parallax being the main antagonist. And at the end of this film, with Hal Jordan now being back in his prime, I think that he could be the Lantern that operates predominantly in space, while John Stewart again stays with the Justice League and remains the main Earth Lantern. As far as Kyle, he can also help out on Earth as well as Hal Jordan, but I would predominantly want both of them to remain in space while John handles the things on Earth. The next project in the saga is Lantern Season 3, and at this point in the DCU, I think that this would come out around the latter half of the 10-year plan. Meaning, like I already kind of said earlier, a lot of things will already be rolling in the DCU. We'd have Batman's mythos fully established at this point, Superman's, the Justice League would be developed, and would be a lot further along. And with this project being set directly after the Green Lantern Rebirth movie, it would follow Hal Jordan adjusting to coming back to life and being free of Parallax. And while I did say that I would want Hal Jordan to remain the Space Lantern, or the Lantern that predominantly handles outer space threats, I would still want this show to focus on some of his time on Earth. So that way, in this season of television, we can get the fleshed out dynamics of Hal Jordan and Green Arrow, or Hal Jordan and Barry Allen, as well as seeing him potentially interact with other members of the League like Batman and Superman. We could also further explore his camaraderie with John Stewart. And even though John Stewart is the main Green Lantern that helps the Justice League, now that Hal Jordan is back to life, like I said, even though he's predominantly outer space, he can still pitch in and help the Justice League at times, and we should see that throughout this season if they make cameos. And through those interactions and Hal Jordan also being outer space, we can plant the seeds for the next big DC Lanterns event, which would be the Sinestro Corp War. So for example, we could get really cool moments like when Batman was able to actually resist the control of a Yellow Lantern ring during the Sinestro Corp War, when Sinestro's lanterns were actually heading out and looking for new members. And that obviously brings us to the next project, which would be the second Green Lantern movie in live action for the DCU, and that is the Sinestro Corp War. And for those of you who don't know, essentially what happens in this comic is Sinestro, who obviously is a rogue lantern, is able to forge his own lantern core with the help of the Anti-Monitor. And obviously the yellow rings that he forges are powered by fear. And then obviously, as I mentioned earlier, these rings would then go throughout the universe and search for new members for this core. And some of the major members that Sinestro was actually able to recruit include the Anti-Monitor himself, Superboy Prime, Cyborg Superman, a Parallax-infected Kyle Rayner, which we'll discuss a little bit later, and also Arkillo, who is essentially Sinestro's Kilowog, but just way more ruthless and obviously evil. Now obviously, I don't think the DCU will have characters like Superboy Prime, the Anti-Monitor, or even Cyborg Superman, but I think that Parallax-possessed Kyle Rayner and Arkillo are a must for this movie, as well as other notable members like Amin Sur, who is the son of Abin Sur, Lyssa Drak, who is the keeper of the Book of Parallax, also Romit Rue, who is a part of the same alien race as Tomartu, and is the most vile serial killer in the entire existence of their race, along with a couple of other prominent Sinestro Corps members. That being said, Sinestro with his newly formed Corps would then launch a brutal invasion on the entirety of the Green Lantern Corps, spreading chaos from Oa to Earth. So much so that along with the Green Lanterns of Earth, the other Justice Leaguers have to then help. And honestly, I don't think that would be an impossible thing to include in this adaptation because of the fact that in Superman, we got the Justice Gang just to assist Superman throughout the movie. So I don't see why in a Green Lantern movie, we couldn't get the Justice League, who already would be established at this point, to help out on a planetary scale invasion. But ultimately, at this project's core, I would want it to heavily focus on the rivalry between Sinestro and Hal Jordan. And even though at this point we would have already seen these two interact, I feel like this movie would be the perfect opportunity to put their dynamic at the forefront. The aftermath of the Sinestro Corps War would immediately lead into Lantern Season 4, which would follow the events of Rage of the Red Lanterns, which would bring Atrocitus back into the fold, who we would have initially saw in Lantern Season 1 in flashbacks between Hal Jordan and Sinestro uncovering the Blackest Night prophecy, which would obviously pull from Secret Origins. With that being said, in Lantern Season 4, we would get further contextualization of those flashbacks, and it would showcase how Atrocitus was actually able to form the Red Lantern Corps. From there, he would go on to try and exact his revenge on the Green Lantern Corps because of the atrocities that the Manhunters committed because of their creation by the Guardians. This series, by extension, would also introduce the Blue Lantern Corps, who initially helped the Green Lanterns in this story in the comics. That being said, I do want to say that I would prefer if this arc lasted only the first half of Lantern Season 4, because in the second half of Lantern Season 4, I would want to get into the events of Agent Orange and introduce Larfleeze, who, for those of you who don't know, is the only member of the Orange Lantern Corps that is powered by greed. And because of the immense power of the Orange Lanterns, this would be the next emotional entity that would come close to engulfing Hal Jordan. And that brings us to the final installment in this Lantern saga, and that is Blackest Night. And I'm sure at this point you guys probably predicted that this is where this was going to go. And honestly, that's just because of the simple fact that Jeff Johns' Green Lantern 2005 run is the best Green Lantern run that we have, and should be the inspiration for the DCU Lantern saga in my humble opinion. So that again brings me to the Blackest Night, which is the emotional climax of the Jeff Johns Green Lantern run from 2005, and is the peak of the entire emotional spectrum saga. This event is also heavily based in cosmic horror, in which death itself rises, and every Lantern Corps is forced to unite against this dead force. And that dead force is none other than Necron, who returned to extinguish all life because he believes that existence itself is a cosmic mistake. Because of this philosophy, he creates the Black Lantern Corps that is powered by death, using the Black Power Rings to resurrect all of the dead and harvest emotions across the DC universe. Now, at this point in the DCU, I don't know what heroes or villains are going to be dead or alive, so I don't know what characters I would want to come back from the dead as Black Lanterns, but whoever does die in the DCU should come back as a Black Lantern if they do in fact do this event. And honestly, I think that this event is so good and so large in scale that you could utilize this as like one of the major crisis events for the DCU. And when I say crisis events, I don't literally mean like Final Crisis or Crisis on Infinite Earths. I mean like the DCU's version of like Endgame. But overall, ladies and gentlemen, that is my ideal DCU Green Lantern saga. Honestly, I don't know if any of the things that I said in this video is going to happen, but in an ideal world, I think that this is the direction that they should go in, especially after the news that we've heard about Hal Jordan and the direction of Lanterns. I also believe that my saga is the best way to accommodate all Lantern fans, because you could accommodate the Hal Jordan fans, which is the large population of the Green Lantern fandom, but then you simultaneously also please John Stewart fans, who are the second largest population in the Green Lantern fandom, and then obviously the third in Kyle Rayner, and also the fourth in Guy Gardner. I feel like every main Lantern could get their props and get their shine in this saga, and we'd also get the 4 Corpsmen for a very long time, which would be really cool to see. But that is going to wrap up this video. If you guys enjoyed this video, please be sure again to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And like always, it's been K the God, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.